Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I've got a really interesting conversation for us tonight with Daniel Dorman. He is the managing editor and director of operations at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. He's a former political staffer to a federal member of parliament and a communications professional with a range of experience in the not-for-profit sector in Canada. But he's written recently a very fascinating article, and I wanted to chat with him about it because it was called Canada's Crisis of Confidence is Crippling Our Country, but Defeatism is the Wrong Response on Canada's Falling Global Standing and Cultural and Political Malaise. Daniel, welcome to the show, sir.
Thanks so much, Brian. It's fantastic to be here. Yeah, and I mean, as you say, I work for the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, which is a federal public policy think tank based out of Ottawa. Our motto is that we want Canada to be the best governed country in the world. So we've got our work cut out for us in some ways. But I'm also a contributor to a group called Young Voices out of the US, which is a fantastic group, basically a talent agency for young people engaging in the political and academic space. And then of significance to this article that you've mentioned, a few years ago, I worked for a Canadian Christian charity called Partners International, and it's with Partners International that I did some travel into Moldova and even briefly into Ukraine in 2022 after Putin's invasion, which is where I start off the article. So that's perhaps a little summary of me, and I'm actually a Mississauga native as well. I grew up there, so great to be on the Mississauga radio station here.
Awesome, appreciate it. So what was your argument?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, fundamentally, I think Canada is struggling to motivate itself, struggling to believe in itself, struggling to value Canada as a national project for a whole bunch of reasons. And I start off the article talking about a trip I took to Moldova and Ukraine, and some of the experiences I had there, where Moldova, for those that don't know, it borders Ukraine. It's a former Soviet Socialist Republic. It's got quite a history, and it really struggles in a whole bunch of ways. I mean, it's good news today is that Moldova they've passed a referendum that they'd like to join the EU, which is a very positive sign for that country, I believe. But nonetheless, they have a pretty fraught history, and you see the ways that the political instability of both recent years and historically works itself out in the ways that they fail to trust political institutions, the ways that their democracy isn't as strong as it could be, issues with corruption and other things, and I couldn't help reflect that Canada is seeming to not to the same degree maybe, but is seeming to start to struggle with some of the same things, a hopelessness, a defeatism, a lack of belief that we can overcome the challenges that we're facing. So that was sort of the impetus to write, and I do believe that there's some ways out of that, which is what I get into in the article a bit as well.
So I got to ask you, I was watching the football game this past weekend, and maybe I was flipping back and forth between Fox and CNN and whoever was broadcasting I guess it was Fox Sports that was broadcasting the football game, and I saw a Trump ad in the United States that was suggesting the United States was just in terrible, terrible, terrible shape, even though their economy seems to be doing extremely well, and the stock market's at an all-time high. And then an ad that Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives had in Canada that was almost like a duplication of the exact same list of problems the country's going through. Is that what's creating the problem, that people are telling us we're in the dumpster?
I think we need to be realistic. I do think that we need to recognize where there's major issues. And I give a short list in the article, and I mean things like the federal government unjustifiably using the Emergencies Act, marking, I think, a very real decline in the rule of law in Canada, which is not a fringe thing. This has been confirmed by a federal court of appeal judge. I mean, credible reports of treasonous behavior in Parliament from the National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians. ethical scandals just endlessly out of Parliament in Canada, real chastisement on the world stage, failing to meet our NATO commitments. There's a lot of reasons why I do think Canadians can be genuinely discouraged, and maybe I won't touch the American pieces as much,
But
but
then,
Canada
but
certainly
then
we are in a rough spot, and
in your
yeah.
article, you compared us to Moldova and said that we were justifiably cynical. And, lots of us have been probably reading the first articles on Moldova that we've read in a long time because of this election that I think they just had. And Russian influence, parties and leaders that are potentially actually funded by Russian backed oligarchs, a part of the country that is a breakaway that has Russian troops. Like, how can you compare us to Moldova?
I mean, I don't think I was comparing the details of foreign interference precisely. I mean, I do think there's relevant aspects of foreign interference in both Canada and certainly in Moldova. Certainly there's nothing like Transnistria in Canada. We don't have a section of our country that's under Russian military control. But I think that we can certainly say, well, Moldova is a country that has struggled economically and politically because of its history, because people have stopped believing in the country, and that in that way there's an overlap with Canada. Even things like the statistics around brain drain to the U.S. and other places where Canada's losing out on talent and productivity and innovation and a lot of pieces. So I don't exactly mean that Canada is a border state with Ukraine, a war zone or anything like that. Certainly not, but more even the atmosphere politically is I think what I would begin to compare.
So what's gone wrong then?
I mean, I think some of the pieces I listed there are really very real concerns. One of the things I haven't mentioned yet is just economically. Our country, I think, has been damaged by pretty counterproductive environmental measures that stifle the natural resource economy, which is by almost every metric, Canada's most productive sector. The Macdonald-Laurier Institute published a great paper on that by Jack Mintz and Philip Cross earlier this year, which really does lay out that sector is our competitive advantage. So, I mean, economically, things are not great. And I think that perhaps the most obvious thing, the thing on everyone's mind, the article on Trudeau in The Economist recently also pulled on this pretty heavily, is just the housing market, that compared to other OECD economies were well below average in terms of the number of houses available and the ways that weighs on Canadians. I think there's a lot of factors that have led to the sort of defeatism and cynicism that Canada's facing.
How do we turn it around?
Yeah, it's that's the question, right? And I think it's absolutely the important question. I mean, I think it does, to go back to what you're saying about these ads, it does, maybe tend towards let's be realistic, let's not sugarcoat, but let's also not just, fall into patterns of self-hatred, of lacking self-esteem, or whatever the equivalent would be on a national level, because I don't think that type of rhetoric becomes unhelpful at a certain point. Certainly, it's if it becomes self-emulation instead of any sort of productive assessment of a situation. And also, I think we need to recognize that it's not hopeless. Even if you read work from Brian Lee Crowley, who's Macdonald-Laurier Institute's founder, you certainly see that Canada, the trajectory of Canada economically has really been up and down over the last 50 years or so. And there was a time, probably in the 80s to early 90s, where things were looking very, very bad, and a sort of cross-partisan consensus about the need for fiscal reform and for control of debt, and all those pieces came in and allowed the country to get on a much better field for a very long time. And so things can turn around economically. Things can be better. But you can't stop at the assessment of the problem. You do have to work towards productive ends, and not wallow or not become apathetic. I think that's many Canadians perhaps are sort of watching from a distance and don't really have a lot of hope for where the country could go. So the encouragement would be to be informed and to get involved and to use our democracy and to vote into all of those pieces, as cliche as they may sound.
Watching from a distance and not thinking there's much hope. That's not a very positive outlook.
um, well, I've told this anecdote a few times recently, but when I tell people I work for a public policy think tank, it's not uncommon for people to go, oh, that's very interesting, but you don't actually think things are going to get better, do you? Or some version of that where it's, oh, well, that's good, but we're never actually going to overcome the housing challenges or the economic challenges or the threat of Russia or the threat of China. Like, there's this sort of like, oh, well, good for you for trying, but throw your whatever the expression would be, the efforts aren't actually going to pan out. And I just think that's just not a way to approach any problem. We have to believe that that situations have been bad before in Canada and elsewhere, certainly, and that things can improve. And that's, if you don't start with some optimism, you won't go very far.
Well, I want to take a break and then come back and ask you about that because in your article you speak about, and I think that you've got these experiences of visiting Ukraine, visiting Moldova, and then also your work with Christian churches and charities dealing with refugee crises. And all three of those examples, people could see pretty negatively, and so how you came away from that with optimism about the future and a belief that good can come from all those situations, I think is going to be instructive. So we're going to take a break and be back in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. My guest tonight is Daniel Dorman. He is the managing editor and director of operations at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. He's a former political staffer to a federal member of parliament and a communications professional with a range of experience in the not-for-profit sector in Canada. We've just been chatting about an article that he wrote recently in The Hub, and it was titled, "Canada's Crisis of Confidence is Crippling Our Country, but Defeatism is the Wrong Response." And you started out this article by talking about your trips to Ukraine post the Russian invasion, Moldova, and also some of the work that you did with Christian churches talking about dealing with the refugee crisis. Tell us a little bit about those trips and those experiences and what you learned, what you saw, and what you think about their current situations.
Yeah, glad to. Absolutely, Brian. When I was in Moldova in 2022, at that point in time, it was approximately 1 in 6 people in the whole country was a refugee streaming through the country throughout the year. So that's, the Canadian comparative would be if we had all of a sudden 7 million refugees in the country, a huge, huge number. It was a time when, there was a lot of fear, going into Ukraine. I think as a Canadian growing up in Canada, we're sheltered by the US to some degree. We don't really have, especially perhaps maybe post Cold War and all these things, we don't have a sense of the possibility really of war or violence, and definitely shifts your perspective to, to stand in a trench and to see, essentially Russian rocket shells that are exploded on the sides of highways and such. So it was a formative trip for me in that way. But I think even more so was what I saw from the church groups that Partners International, the Canadian charity I was traveling for, got to work with. Just really phenomenal mobilization of people that are just people, and they're Moldovans. They live in a country which is by a lot of metrics the poorest country in Europe, based GDP per capita and other things, but they put aside their own wants and needs and they go and serve. And these churches were serving through the government-run refugee centers as well as setting up their own. They had things like a 24-hour hotline to address human trafficking, because as the Ukrainian, mostly women and children were fleeing violence, there's this huge risk of traffickers taking advantage of that. And so they were doing what they could to address it with a hotline and some very courageous people. They wouldn't want me to praise their actions, so I won't say their names, but some courageous guys that were, they have stories of pulling people out of cars that were destined to be trafficked. Really fantastic partner there. So I think when you see that, when you see charity in action, when you see faith in action, when you see people that are filled with hope in spite of circumstances that are, significantly, massively more dire than anything Canadians are facing right now, or at least the vast majority of Canadians, it does fill you with hope. It does make you realize that more can be done. It made me realize I can do more, but it also makes me realize that Canadians can do a lot more. That we can be a lot more positive about our circumstances. That we can seek institutional change. Some of the other things that these charities get involved with is because Moldova itself is a hub for human trafficking, is education in schools for how young people can avoid any contact with the networks through which they might end up being trafficked. Like phenomenal work to that takes a great deal of effort, but these people are pulling it off. So I think that was very formative for me. I don't know if you can see it on the screen, but I keep next to me these armbands that I wore on my trip into Ukraine, just as a memory of those individuals that so inspired me. Yeah.
Tell me what you think about the situation Ukraine is in right now. Obviously Russian advances in the east, but they've been able to make some inroads into taking Russian territory in the north. The defense secretary from the United States supposedly announcing another $500 million worth of funding. What do you think's going on?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's been a long road for Ukraine. Obviously, I mean, this isn't a strategic analysis of the conflict, but you see things online of just exhausted Ukrainians and the stories of people. I was there years ago now, and the stories of pulling people out of rubble haven't stopped. And so I really think that and this is something, for example, Dr. Balkan Devlin from the Macdonald Laurier Institute will say often that it's a civilizational conflict in Ukraine. It's one that has implications. If Putin wins, there's no reason that an imperialist power like Putin's Russia just stops and is happy with Ukraine, especially as we've discussed when a country like Moldova exists with a segment of its geography sectioned off by Russian military because of its history with the USSR. So I do think it's something that I'm not sure people in the West have really reckoned with how significant it is for our own future safety and security. Or that governments have really reckoned with it. There's a great piece on the Macdonald Laurier Institute by Aaron Gash-Burnett. He talks about how Canadians could make use of sanctioning Russian assets, and actually not just sanctioning, but using Russian assets towards the Ukrainian war effort. If those assets are held in the EU or in Canada, it's a sort of a unique policy idea to further the war effort and get them some resources without necessarily pulling more from Canadian tax dollars. And I think that's very worthy of consideration to support that effort further.
I've interviewed Marcus Kolga, who I think writes and works with you as well. And he is a student of history and says that this is very similar to, World War II, and that we've got to give a lot of thought to, what Putin is doing and the steps that he took that, look a lot like what Hitler may have done in Czechoslovakia and in Austria, the attack of Poland, and then, attacks that went farther after that. Are we potentially at World War III? We've got what's going on in Ukraine. We've got war in the Middle East. There's certainly pressures in the Pacific. What's going on?
Yeah, I mean, I do think we are seeing something of a new authoritarian axis of Russia, and certainly China has been supporting Russia. Iran has been supporting Russia in that. So these conflict zones are not disconnected, or these tension areas are not disconnected. I mean, I think whether it results in something like a World War III may depend on how the West responds now, on how if we're determined that these if Ukraine is the canary in the coal mine and Putin is routed and authoritarians learn a lesson that maybe they can't just walk into to free democratic nations and cause havoc, then maybe it doesn't get there. But I do think, we do need to reckon with some pretty dark realities, some real enemies in the world. Enemies is not a word I think Canadians use very often. We're not comfortable with it, but when people are invading other countries, it's hard to think of a more fitting noun.
Okay, but
So yeah.
help me if I, you're plugged in far better than I. Given what you've just described, and a couple of minutes ago you talked about how we're not living up to our NATO commitments. Like, wouldn't there be almost no other better time or more important time for us to live up to our NATO commitments than right now?
Yeah, absolutely. It's something we need to do, and it's something actually in the summer. Pierre Poilievre was asked about it if he were to form government, if he would prioritize that, and he wasn't able to commit to it either. I do think there was quite a positive announcement from Minister Melanie Joly not too long ago about forming a collection of democratic nations to discuss Arctic security. I think that's a positive move, something that could be built upon because, of course, if you just look at a world map, you forget that Russia has to just has to go over the top to get to Canada, and that there is a real geopolitical tension and pieces that are tense around the Arctic and around the Canadian Arctic. Other fellows in the Macdonaldians like Rob Hubert have written really well about this, about China's capacity with icebreakers and other technologies that are really would exclusively be used in a northern conflict, in a conflict where these authoritarian powers are coming over the top of the world to attack NATO or to attack Canada and our allies. So it's a very real threat, and it is time for our leaders to recognize that. I mean, again, I do think there are nations that are doing this well. If you talk about how other European nations have responded, whether that's Norway or Sweden or Finland, they've turned their spending around. Some of them joined NATO as a recognition of the changing world that we're in. And so there is some models that Canada could follow in terms of how to get our spending up, how to do that intelligently, the national security front on defense on many pieces.
You mentioned a couple of minutes ago the Economist article about Canada and housing, criticizing our situation with housing. Housing prices are a lot of people think twice as much as they would be in a comparable city in the United States relative to income. Housing starts today are the same as they were in the 1970s when our population has doubled in size. I've interviewed some people that think that this is a intergenerational inequity where there's an incredible wealth transfer from young people to old people, which is sort of the opposite of what we've typically thought, that every generation leaves the next generation better off. And then, in this current situation, we've got the Bloc Québécois demanding, increased pensions. We've got, people not willing to give up their net worth such that we can actually lower housing prices. What's gone wrong with housing?
Yeah, certainly a major topic as well. And of course, the federal government just about a month ago now, maybe slightly more, released the new mortgage regulations allowing for 30-year amortization on new homes, increasing essentially the number of people that are eligible for longer financing. And what I really think is that if you put it in the simplest economic terms, supply and demand, that a lot of the government measures that are intending to be helpful really may end up simply increasing demand. And so, even if, and what we need is supply, what we need is more houses. And as you say, construction starts are low. The construction industry in Canada is struggling to scale. I believe the statistics out of the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation are that around 70% of Canadian construction companies have less than 5 employees. Now, small businesses are great, but of course there's a productivity challenge if you can't scale and if you can't build more houses. So there's industry challenges. There's ways we need to address the core issue with it, which is supply. And then as I said, there's probably ways in which measures that admittedly do sound good. More people eligible for mortgages sounds good as a policy, but the reality is if it's simply increasing demand and with that increasing prices, it's not ultimately going to help Canadians. So yeah, we need to address the core supply issues as opposed to just continuing to produce more demand.
One of the frustrations I've got on this issue is that I think that government could solve the problem, but governments aren't working together at different levels to solve the problem. That municipal governments have regulations and red tape and development fees and things like that stand in the way of increased supply. That provincial governments sometimes have talked about making some improvements here and then have backtracked it against political opposition. A year and a half ago, the federal government said the federal government doesn't have a role in housing, and then in the budget sort of changed the tune and said we do have a role in housing. And some people say that them backing out of social housing was the major issue. And there's a lot of finger pointing and blame making, but not a lot of solution solving. What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it is an area, um, and forgive me for another MLI Macdonald Laurier Institute work plug, but we have a great podcast out recently between Peter Copeland and Matt Spoke, who's a real estate and housing expert, and he talked about how really the relevant federal policy is immigration, right? Because that's of course another major source of demand. If you add in 2023 Canada expanded by more than 1 million people, and that of course makes the ratio of people to houses smaller, right? So there is it's not that the federal government isn't relevant. I do think there's the Macdonald Laurier Institute wants to focus on the intelligent use of federal power, and as the federal government sort of does start to stick its hands into more pieces, whether through funding transfers or programs directly, like the Housing Accelerator Fund and others that are ostensibly should be probably more provincial jurisdiction in particular, that our remit seems to keep growing, but not because we want it to, but because the federal government keeps pushing beyond its mandate. So I do think a lot comes down to coordination between not necessarily the federal government. Of course, the federal government plays a piece with immigration policy, but more so between the provinces and the municipalities. Municipalities really are provincial entities, and there's ways in which that the provincial governments in particular probably could be doing more to ensure their own that they're not putting in red tape, but also that where they have the control to push municipalities to remove red tape, that they do so as well. Yeah.
In your article, you talked about how you think some of these problems that we've got right now can be solved if people knew a little bit more about our history and had civic education. And you talk a little bit about how you think people misunderstood John A. Macdonald. Let's take a break for some messages and come back after the messages and understand exactly what your argument is here, why you think civic understanding and history understanding could actually help solve some of this malaise that we're in. Stay with us, everyone. We'll be back in just 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I'm chatting tonight with Daniel Dorman. He's the managing editor and director of operations at the Macdonald Laurier Institute. The Macdonald Laurier Institute is a think tank, one of Canada's best-known think tanks. And Daniel has written a really interesting article about Canada and our malaise right now. And he's called Canada's Crisis of Confidence is Crippling Our Country, but Defeatism is the Wrong Response. I was really fascinated. You talked about Ukraine, you talked about Moldova, you talked about refugee crises, and almost as though those people had it far worse than us, and yet were more positive. And then you talked about how Canadians have got to understand more of our history and have better civic knowledge. And then you used John A. Macdonald and some issues about that as an example. Tell me, what's John A. Macdonald got to do with this argument?
Yeah, I think it does just plays into how we view our history is going to play into how we view our nation as a whole, whether our country is worth investing in now. If it's a nation founded on genocide and racism and all these allegations that get thrown around, then of course people don't want to build more houses here. It's sort of there's a spiritual component, there's a motivational component behind some of these things. Sir John A. Macdonald in particular, perhaps, I'm a relatively young Canadian. I think I grew up in the atmosphere where most of what I heard about Sir John A. Macdonald was quite negative. I knew that schools in my region were considering changing their names if they had names and statues were being pulled down and all these pieces. And I even personally just didn't have a positive view of Macdonald, but with that didn't attach myself to Canada very much in some ways. And then, but I've been fortunate to interact and to be pushed to read some of Sir John A. Macdonald's actual speeches. And it's a very different portrait. It's a portrait, where his vision for Canada was characterized by a belief in the equality of all people beyond race or religion and all these pieces. In the language of the 1860s, but nonetheless in, really profound sentiments that I think are a part of the DNA of Canada, are a part of what has made Canada a fantastic country, are a part of what has made Canada a place that people from all over the world still want to come. I mean, we were just talking about our immigration numbers. You don't get a million new people if a million new people don't want to come within a year, right? So I do think it's something that to be frank, post-colonial theorists, or there's different phrases for the types of activists that throw around the allegations against Canada and sort of paint a pretty dishonest, a pretty unbalanced, maybe to be more fair, unbalanced picture of what Canada has been, and that is really detrimental to our future prosperity, to our future vision of and social cohesion as a nation.
In the
Yeah.
article, you said that we have to stop lying about our history. Do you actually think we've been lying about our history?
I do think so. Yeah. I mean, I think that there's some clear examples, and whether it's lying by omission or lying by just presenting an unbalanced approach. I think people would be shocked to read the speeches of Sir John A. People would be surprised by the fairness that he proposed, by the equality of all peoples that he proposed. I think that we've been lied in that we've come to think of him as somebody who's defined almost exclusively by his failures with Indigenous peoples, which are real, no doubt about it. But there's a lot more to that story, and there's a balanced version of history to be told there. I do think it's an important aspect of this conversation.
Was it right or wrong for the Toronto Metropolitan University to change its name from Ryerson?
I mean, I'm not sure I'd have a particular opinion. Patrice Dutil, who's one of our Macdonald Laurier Institute senior fellows, he's the guy to ask. He's written some great work on Ryerson and on that history for MLI. I don't think it was needed. I do think, once again, a balanced assessment of Ryerson is the better option, and that this sort of culture of disassociating from our history, of not learning about it once we remove the names, whether it's good or bad, is actually not the road, regardless of how we land on the legacy of a particular figure. So, no, I don't think it was needed, to put it bluntly. But go check out Patrice Dutil's work. He's a great scholar on that issue.
You then said we should start reading a bunch of political theorists and work. Tell me, where's that coming from?
Sure. I mean, I mentioned figures like George Orwell, his Down and Out in Paris and London, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the Gulag Archipelago, or Václav Havel, who's the former president of the Czech Republic. But in all these figures, they really give us a picture of life, of challenges, economic challenges. I mean, you think Canada's facing economic challenges, and we are, but go read Orwell's Down and Out in Paris and London, and realize how profoundly grateful we should. And if you think we're having political challenges, go read the Gulag Archipelago and some of the just horrific events of the 20th century in Soviet Russia under Stalin. And I won't go. Don't read it before bed. It's a tragic account. It's a stomach turning account. But again, if we can become aware of these pieces of history that are really very recent in some cases, 80 years ago or less in some cases. Or with the case of Václav Havel, and forgive me, I'm terrible at pronouncing his name, but former president and first president of the independent Czech Republic. He is also a dissident under communism, and he was right up until the fall of the USSR. This is recent history, but these are people who overcame as well, right? Like that's ultimately it. I think they can give us a sense of gratitude for what we have, and they can show us circumstances that are much worse than our own, and yet they persevered for good things. So in some ways, I view those figures, Orwell, Solzhenitsyn, Havel, in the same way that I view my heroes in Moldova and in Ukraine. That there is. There's good in the world, and it's worth fighting for it, to be tacky and quote Tolkien, but it's true. So let's get in touch with history. Let's be grateful for what we have, and let's not be overcome with defeatism. That's the summary, I think.
I had an interesting interview yesterday with an economist who was pretty negative on our current economic situation in Canada. And his argument was that what we needed to have was a national conversation. And he used a couple different examples from our past, the Macdonald Royal Commission, where a Royal Commission that was commissioned by the Liberals but received by a conservative government, or at least implemented by a conservative government, traveled across the country, ended up writing 26 volumes, and ended up, having a fairly major radical recommendation of free trade between Canada and the United States that even after all that process of that national conversation needed to be solved by or settled by a election that was fought on that, and a close election that was not a foregone conclusion. And then in the 1990s, a currency crisis, a debt crisis that there wasn't an all-party agreement on, but two of the three major parties, or two of the four major parties, did come to an agreement on the need for a fairly major change. And so a very conservative agenda, arguably, was implemented by a Liberal Party. Paul Martin, the finance minister, and Jacques Chrétien, the prime minister at the time, implemented the most drastic reduction in federal spending that we've almost ever had, other than after World War II. Is there the catalyst for and the ability for people to work really in more than one party for that kind of national conversation, debate, and then to hopefully come together and implement something today?
I certainly hope so, and that history you're laying out is some of what I was alluding to earlier, because things have been rough in Canada in certain ways, and there was that at least bipartisan consensus that there needed to be fiscal responsibility and to implement the Macdonald Commission in those pieces. I do think we are. We're in a rough spot. So if I were to be so bold as to offer advice to a potential incoming conservative government, that's just based on the polls, not any personal prediction, but be honest with Canadians about how long it's going to take and the upward fight we have, and also recognizing that we're due to renew our CUSMA, which is the update of NAFTA, which is that free trade piece with the US that you mentioned. Let's make sure that we are thinking responsibly about our relationship with the US. Macdonald Law Institute, recognizing that this was coming about a year ago, we launched the Center for North American Prosperity and Security in Washington, D.C., precisely to be able to address some of these issues on defense, national security, and trade, that we know are going to be significant for Canada as well as the States coming up. Yeah.
I like your attitude. I appreciate you writing the article. I thought it was very provocative, and thank you so much for coming on our show tonight and telling us a little bit about the examples of places that have got it far worse and the times that have got it far worse than us, and that we should be a little bit more positive, but that we do have some challenges and that we've got to do something to solve it. And I do firmly believe that housing is one of them. Our national debt is another. I think NATO and lack of funding there is another. And
Yeah.
so I think we got to do something. There's just no question about it. And I hope that the role that you and Macdonald Laurier are doing is helpful in that process. Thank you very much. If people want to access some of your writing or from the Macdonald Laurier, how do they get that?
Yeah, mcdonaldlaurier.ca, or you can find us on socials. Yeah, we're on Twitter, X, LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, the like. So find us wherever you are, or connect with me, Daniel Dorman, and I'll send you essays about Macdonald or whatever it is you want to know. Yeah, I really would love to chat with Canadians that are ready to get more involved to push past defeatism. So thanks so much, Brian. Really glad to be
I
here.
appreciate it. And let's chat again.
Talk soon. Thanks.
That's our show for tonight, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I remind you, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online at www.saga960am.ca, even from Moldova or Ukraine or wherever you happen to be. All my podcasts and videos go up on social media, on podcast servers, on YouTube as soon as my radio show goes to air. So subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thanks so much. Good night, everybody.